A Greek taxi driver donated his Mercedes W123 to the Mercedes-Benz Museum with 2.9 million miles on the original engine. 2.9 million. That's the distance from Earth to the moon and back, 6 times on one engine, in a car that was built to last 200,000 miles and forgot to stop. These 12 cars were so overbuilt, so ridiculously over-engineered, that the companies who made them actually lost money because the cars refused to die. The owners never came back, and the accountants never forgave the engineers. Let's count up. Number 12, Volkswagen Beetle, 1938 to 2003. The Volkswagen Beetle was originally designed by Ferdinand Porsche under a mandate from a government that doesn't exist anymore, and then outlived that government by 60 years. Over 21.5 million units were built across 65 years of production, making the Beetle the longest produced single-design car in automotive history. The air-cooled flat-4 engine in the back was so simple that a farmer in Brazil, a surfer in California, and a taxi driver in Mexico City could all fix it with the same set of hand tools and zero training. Here's what made VW lose money on this thing for decades. The Beetle was so cheap to maintain, so easy to repair, and so impossible to kill that owners never needed a new one. Volkswagen kept trying to replace it with more profitable models, and customers kept saying no. Mexico built Beetles until 2003 because the market literally wouldn't accept the replacement. The engine ran at such conservative power levels that internal wear barely registered over a normal lifespan. A car built so far below its mechanical limits that it was essentially loafing through its entire existence. And here's the crazy part. VW didn't overbuild the Beetle on purpose. They just built a simple car correctly, and correctness turned out to be immortal. The Beetle is proof that the most dangerous thing you can do to an accountant is build a product that works exactly as advertised, because then nobody ever buys the next version. A car so simple, it became immortal. The next one was built by an aircraft company, and they engineered it like they were afraid it would crash from the sky. Number 11, Saab 900, 1978 to 1993. Saab was an aircraft manufacturer before it was a car company, and the 900 was designed by engineers who couldn't stop thinking in terms of crash survival, structural redundancy, and the kind of over-engineering that makes sense when your previous product flew at 30,000 feet. The 900's body structure used a full-length safety cage, aircraft-grade door hinges, and a wraparound windshield bonded into the chassis as a structural element, techniques borrowed directly from fighter jet canopy design. The ignition key was between the seats rather than on the steering column because Saab's engineers determined that column-mounted keys could injure a driver's knees in a collision. An aircraft company's paranoia about impact applied to a car. The B201 and B202 turbocharged engines were built with bottom-end components strong enough to handle boost levels far beyond what Saab ever used in production, meaning the factory power output was the engine barely waking up. Swedish mechanics described the 900 Turbo as a car that runs at 30% of its capacity during normal driving, which is why they routinely cross 300,000 miles on original internals. Saab lost money because they built a car that lasted so long, buyers only came back when their children needed one. And by then, the parents were still driving theirs, built like a fighter jet, priced like a Volvo, and impossible to wear out. An aircraft company's car that lasted like a plane. The next one was AMC's last act of defiance, a cockroach that refused to die even after the company that built it went bankrupt. Number 10, Jeep Cherokee XJ, 1984 to 2001. The Jeep Cherokee XJ was designed by American Motors Corporation, a company that went bankrupt, got swallowed by Chrysler, and ceased to exist. But the truck they left behind refused to follow its maker into the grave. The AMC 4.0-liter inline-6 is one of the most overbuilt engines ever fitted to an American vehicle. A cast-iron block with a forged crankshaft, a design so conservative and so massively over-toleranced that the engine outlasts every other component on the vehicle by a factor that borders on comedic. The XJ rusts around the engine, the body falls apart around the engine, and the engine just sits there, running perfectly, wondering why nobody else can keep up. Chrysler kept making the XJ for 17 years, an eternity in automotive production, because every time they tried to replace it with something more profitable, buyers revolted. The unibody chassis with solid axles was supposed to be a cost-cutting compromise, but it accidentally created the most capable compact SUV of the 1980s and 1990s. Police departments, forest services, and rural mail carriers ran XJs past 400,000 miles on engines that mechanics describe as too dumb to know they should have broken by now. You can buy one for $3,000 to $8,000, and the engine will still be running when your grandchildren learn to drive. Built by a dead company, still running when everything else from that era is scrap. The next one refused to die even when a television show literally tried to kill it. Number 9, Toyota Hilux, 1968 to 2004. Top Gear drowned a Toyota Hilux in the ocean, set it on fire, dropped it from a crane, put it on top of a building that was then demolished with explosives, and it started on the first turn of the key every single time. That wasn't a stunt. That was a demonstration of what Toyota had already known for decades. The Hilux was built so far beyond its intended operating parameters that nothing short of physically melting the engine block could prevent it from functioning. The 22R and 22RE four-cylinder engines used timing chains instead of belts, cast iron blocks instead of aluminum, and internal tolerances so conservative that the engine is barely working during normal driving, like hiring an Olympic athlete to carry your groceries. United Nations convoys in Africa, mining operations in Australia, and military units across the Middle East ran Hiluxes past 1 million miles because the vehicle was designed for markets where a breakdown didn't mean calling a tow truck. It meant walking for 3 days. Toyota didn't overbuild the Hilux because they wanted to. They overbuilt it because their customers lived in places where a dead truck could become a dead driver. The Hilux cost Toyota repeat customers for generations because the first one never needed replacing. One mechanic in Kenya described the Hilux as the truck that put me out of business. I've been maintaining the same 40 trucks for 15 years and none of them have broken. A truck that survived drowning, fire, and a building collapse. The next car looks like a refrigerator, and it has the same lifespan as one too. Number 8, Volvo 240, 1974 to 1993. The Volvo 240 was produced for 19 consecutive years, making it one of the longest production runs of any single model in automotive history. And the reason Volvo couldn't kill it is the same reason owners couldn't kill it. The car was built like a Swedish bomb shelter with wheels. The red block B21 and B230 engines, named for the red-painted cam covers, used thick cast iron blocks, forged crankshafts, and internal components so overbuilt that mechanics described them as the engine equivalent of building a house with bridge-rated steel. One Volvo 240, driven by Irv Gordon, wasn't the million-mile car, that was his P1800, but 240S routinely cross 500,000 miles with nothing replaced beyond wear items. Volvo used 30 pounds of rust-proofing wax in the body cavities during manufacturing, an expensive process that most competitors skipped entirely, giving the 240 a corrosion resistance that made it the cockroach of Scandinavian engineering. The chassis was designed to exceed government crash standards by a margin so large that Volvo engineers later admitted they'd overbuilt the structure because they didn't trust the standards to protect occupants adequately. Volvo lost money, not because the car was expensive to build, but because an owner who bought one in 1978 didn't need another car until 1998, a 20-year gap between purchases that no accountant could justify. A refrigerator on wheels that lasted 20 years between purchases. The next car was designed by the grandson of the man who founded Porsche, and his perfectionism nearly bankrupted Volkswagen. Number 7, Audi 5100, 1982 to 1991. The Audi 5000, known as the Audi 100 outside America, was the car that Ferdinand Piëch used to prove a point that nearly destroyed Volkswagen's budget, that a mass-market sedan could be built with the tolerances of a race car. Piëch, the grandson of Ferdinand Porsche himself, insisted on panel gaps measured in fractions of a millimeter, fully galvanized bodies that wouldn't rust for decades, and an aerodynamic coefficient of 0.30 CD that made the Audi 100 the most aerodynamic production sedan on Earth when it launched. The wind tunnel testing alone cost more than most competitors spent developing an entire car. The galvanized body was the specific detail that made VW's accountants lose sleep. Full zinc coating on every panel, every seam, every hidden cavity. No competitor offered this at the price point. The result was a car that emerged from Minnesota winters and German Autobahn salt without a speck of rust, while competitors from the same era dissolved like sugar in rain. Piëch was eventually promoted to run all of Volkswagen Group. But the lesson the Audi 100 taught the industry was uncomfortable. Building a car to last meant building a car that buyers never needed to replace, which meant the engineering department's triumph was the sales department's nightmare. The grandson of Porsche, who built a sedan that wouldn't rust, and nearly bankrupted the company doing it. The next one is Japanese, and Toyota spent more money developing it than any car in history at that point. Number 6. Lexus LS 400, 1990 to 2000. Toyota spent $1 billion, hired 1,400 engineers, built 900 prototype engines, and tested across 1.67 million miles of real-world driving to build the Lexus LS 400, the most expensive new car development program in automotive history at that time. And then they priced it below the Mercedes and BMW it was designed to destroy, accepting razor-thin margins on every unit sold because the goal wasn't profit, it was humiliation. Toyota wanted to prove that the world's most reliable luxury car could be built by a company that had never built a luxury car before. And they succeeded so completely that the industry has spent 3 decades trying to pretend it didn't happen. The 1UZF E4.0-liter V8 was balanced with champagne glasses on the valve covers at idle, and they didn't spill. A variant was later FAA certified for aircraft. The engine was designed so far below its maximum operating capacity that normal driving, even aggressive highway driving, barely registers as work. Documented examples have crossed 1 million miles on original internals. Toyota lost money on early LS 400 units because the development cost was astronomical and the pricing was deliberately aggressive. But the real loss was invisible. Every LS 400 sold was a customer who never came back to the dealership for repairs, never traded up early, and never generated the after-sale revenue that luxury car business models depend on. Built like a vault, priced like a sacrifice. A $1 billion bet that lost money per unit. The next car is American, and it survived 500,000 miles of police abuse and taxi punishment without complaining once. Number 5. Ford Crown Victoria, 1991 to 2011. The Ford Crown Victoria was never supposed to be reliable. It was supposed to be cheap, simple, and easy to replace. A fleet vehicle for police departments, taxi companies, and government motor pools that would be rotated out every 100,000 miles and crushed. Instead, the Crown Vic survived 400,000 to 500,000 miles of the most abusive driving conditions in the American automotive industry. 24-hour police shifts with engines idling for 8 hours straight, New York City taxi duty with potholes, speed bumps, and passengers slamming doors 200 times a day, and kept running as if nothing had happened. The 4.6-liter modular Phi-8 uses a cast iron block with forged connecting rods and tolerances so conservative that the engine is essentially sleeping during normal use. The 4-speed automatic is crude, inefficient, and virtually unbreakable, a transmission that trades refinement for the kind of durability that only matters when your workday is 500 miles long and the vehicle needs to start again tomorrow at 5 a.m. without negotiation. Ford lost money on the Crown Vic not because it was expensive to build, but because fleet customers kept the vehicles twice as long as projected, cutting replacement orders in half and destroying the fleet cycle revenue model that Ford's entire commercial division was built on. You can buy a retired police unit for $2,000 to $5,000 with a documented 400,000-mile service life, built like a cockroach with a badge, 500,000 miles of taxi abuse, and still running. The next car wasn't a car at all. It was a truck that the United Nations trusted with human lives in war zones. Number 4. Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40, 1960 to 1984. The Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 was designed for one purpose: to go where nothing else could go and come back without needing anything. The F-Series and two F inline-6 engines use cast iron blocks with bearing clearances so generous and component dimensions so oversized that the engines can operate with degraded oil, contaminated fuel, and minimal coolant, in conditions that would seize a modern engine in minutes. The FJ40 wasn't built to be comfortable. It was built to keep people alive in places where mechanical failure meant waiting for rescue that might never arrive. United Nations humanitarian convoys, Australian outback mining operations, African safari companies, and military units across Southeast Asia deployed FJ40SS as frontline vehicles. Not because they were the best trucks available, but because they were the only trucks that reliably came back. Toyota overbuilt the FJ40 so aggressively that the production cost per unit exceeded what the market would pay, forcing Toyota to subsidize early models with profits from its its sedan lineup. The company accepted the loss because the Land Cruiser's reputation was building Toyota's global brand credibility in markets where no amount of advertising could substitute for a vehicle that simply never broke down. Clean FJ 40S now command $30,000 to $100,000, a price range that would have horrified Toyota's accountants in 1965 and delighted them in 2026. A truck trusted with human lives in war zones. The next car is called the last real Mercedes, and the reason will make you understand why modern Mercedes gave up trying. Number 3, Mercedes-Benz W124, 1984 to 1997. The Mercedes-Benz W124 is known as the last real Mercedes, the final generation built under the old philosophy that a Mercedes should be engineered to survive anything rather than engineered to be replaced on schedule. The W124 underwent the most rigorous pre-production testing Mercedes had ever conducted. 180 prototypes were tortured across 30 million kilometers of testing before a single car reached a customer. The paint process alone involved 10 coats of anti-corrosion treatment, primer, base, and clear, a sequence so labor-intensive and expensive that Mercedes quietly reduced it in subsequent generations. Because the cars were lasting so long, they destroyed the replacement cycle. The OM601 and OM602 diesel engines in the W124 are considered among the most durable internal combustion engines ever manufactured, routinely documented past 500,000 miles on original internals with nothing more than oil changes and filter replacements. Mercedes engineers later admitted that the W124 was built too well, a statement that sounds like a compliment until you realize it means the company recognized it was losing money because the cars wouldn't die fast enough to generate replacement sales. The W124 is why modern Mercedes cars are built to a different standard, not because the engineering got worse, but because the accountants finally won the argument against the engineers. You can find clean diesel examples for $5,000 to $15,000, the last real Mercedes, for the price of a monthly payment on the ones that replaced it. Built too well, from the manufacturer's own mouth. And now, number 1, the car with 2.9 million miles on its original engine. Number 2, Toyota Hilux, 1968 to 2004. Wait, didn't we already cover the Hilux? No, that was the Hilux as an overbuilt truck. This is the Hilux as a phenomenon, because no discussion of cars that cost manufacturers money is complete without acknowledging that the Toyota Hilux has been actively undermining Toyota's new truck sales for over 50 years. And Toyota still can't stop it. In Africa, used Hiluxes from the 1980s and 1990s are still the primary commercial vehicle in countries where the newest Toyota offerings sit untouched on dealer lots, because nobody trusts anything that isn't a 20-year-old Hilux with 400,000 kilometers on the clock and 0 recorded failures. Toyota engineered a truck so indestructible that it created a self-sustaining used market that competes directly with Toyota's own new vehicle sales, a problem no other manufacturer in the world has ever faced because no other manufacturer ever built something durable enough to cause it. The Hilux costs Toyota money not once, but continuously. Every used Hilux that survives another year is a new Hilux that doesn't get sold, built too tough to replace, too cheap to abandon, too proven to doubt. The Hilux is a cockroach that ate Toyota's own lunch, and Toyota is still feeding it, because the alternative is admitting that the best truck they ever made was built 40 years ago, and nothing they've produced since can convince the people who depend on it to upgrade. A truck that's been cannibalizing its own manufacturer's sales for 50 years. And now, the most overbuilt car ever manufactured, the car with 2.9 million miles. Number 1, Mercedes-Benz W123, 1976 to 1985. Thessaloniki, Greece, 2004. A taxi driver named Gregorios Sakinidis drove his 1976 Mercedes-Benz 240D into the Mercedes-Benz Museum in Stuttgart and handed them the keys. The odometer read 4.6 million kilometers, 2.86 million miles. The original OM616 diesel engine was still running, not rebuilt, not replaced. The original engine. A car designed to last 200,000 miles had crossed 2.9 million, 14 times its intended lifespan, on nothing more than oil changes, filter replacements, and the kind of mechanical stubbornness that defies every economic model the automotive industry has ever built. The W123 was manufactured with 30 pounds of cavity wax pumped into every body panel during assembly. A rust-proofing process so expensive that no competitor replicated it, and Mercedes itself quietly abandoned it in later generations. The OM6 173.0-liter 5-cylinder diesel was built with tolerances that allowed the engine to run at a fraction of its maximum capacity during normal driving, meaning the pistons, bearings, and crankshaft barely knew they were working. Mercedes sold 2.7 million W123s and then watched in financial horror, as almost none of them came back for replacement. Used W123s sold for more than their original purchase price on the secondary market because demand outstripped supply. Buyers were willing to pay a premium for a used car over waiting for a new one. Mercedes lost an entire generation of repeat customers who simply never needed another car. 2.9 million miles, one engine, one taxi driver, and a car company that built something so good it nearly destroyed the business model that paid for it. That's not over-engineering. That's engineering so honest it became an accident the industry spent the next 40 years trying to never repeat. 12 cars built by engineers who cared more about the product than the profit margin. A Beetle that lasted 65 years. A Volvo packed with 30 pounds of wax. A Crown Vic that survived 500,000 miles of taxi abuse. And a Mercedes with 2.9 million miles on its original engine. They don't build them like this anymore. Now you know why. Because building them like this made the accountants cry. Which one are you still driving? Comments. Subscribe. The next list will make you angry at modern engineering.